3 men were buried in shallow graves before dawn, hands bound, mouths filled with dirt. By sunrise, the man who ordered it was scrubbing blood off marble floors inside his enemy's mansion, head down, invisible. Salvatore De Luca had spent 20 years making men tremble at the sound of his name. Now he was terrified of being ignored, because the daughter of his greatest enemy had just walked past him without flinching, and for reasons he couldn't explain, that haunted him more than any war ever had. Men like Salvatore don't kneel unless they're burying someone. They don't disappear unless death is chasing them. So when the most feared man in the city trades his gun for a mop and steps into the home of the man he swore to destroy, you need to ask, what could possibly be worth that risk? Because by the time you find out, nothing about power, loyalty, or survival will look the same, and neither will he. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the armor you built to survive becomes the cage that kills you. What would make a man who ruled through fear choose silence as his weapon? Why would someone who spent decades refusing to kneel suddenly bow his head in the house of his enemy? And how does the daughter of your rival become the one person capable of unraveling everything you've built? Was this strategy? Or was Salvatore De Luca walking into something he couldn't control, something that would cost him more than territory, more than respect, more than blood? Because here's what nobody tells you about power. It doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see yourself. And when you've lived so long behind a mask of terror, what happens when someone finally looks at you and sees nothing to fear? By the end of this story, you'll understand why some wars aren't won with violence, why some battles are fought in whispers, in glances, in the quiet moments when no one's watching, and why the most dangerous thing Salvatore ever did wasn't killing his enemies. It was letting one of them see him as human. Before we go deeper into what happened inside that house, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what Salvatore discovered didn't just change his life. It exposed a truth about power that most people spend their whole lives running from. And you won't want to miss what happens next. Salvatore De Luca didn't choose violence. Violence chose him. He was 8 years old when he watched his father dragged from their apartment in the middle of the night, beaten on the street while neighbors closed their curtains and pretended not to hear. His mother held him back, whispering the lesson that would shape his entire life. In this world, you're either feared or forgotten. There is no middle ground. By 15, Salvatore understood power better than most men twice his age. He learned that loyalty without fear is just a prettier word for betrayal. That mercy is a luxury only the protected can afford. That the moment you show weakness, the world devours you. So he stopped showing it. He built himself into something cold, something calculated, something that didn't flinch when hard choices needed to be made. And it worked. By his mid-30s, Salvatore controlled half the city without ever raising his voice. He didn't need to. His reputation did the work for him. Men paid their debts before he asked. Witnesses forgot what they saw. Rivals reconsidered their ambitions the moment his name entered the conversation. He ruled through silence, through patience, through the kind of fear that doesn't announce itself but lingers in every room like smoke. Across the city, Vincenzo Romano ruled differently. Where Salvatore was ice, Romano was fire. Loud, explosive, emotional. He believed power had to be refreshed constantly, that fear required spectacle, that people needed reminders of who held the leash. Romano's men were loyal not because they respected him, but because they were terrified of what he'd do if they weren't. He burned bridges, started fights, made examples out of minor infractions. Every slight was personal. Every disagreement was war. Salvatore found it exhausting, inefficient, dangerous. But he also knew Romano wasn't stupid. Reckless, yes. Unstable, absolutely. But not stupid. And that made him the most unpredictable kind of enemy. The kind who didn't care about consequences as long as he got to watch something burn. Their rivalry didn't start with violence. It started with a handshake. Years ago, When territories were being divided and old bosses were falling, Salvatore and Romano stood on opposite sides of a negotiation table and agreed to peace. Not because they liked each other, because war was bad for business. But peace between men like them was always temporary. It was just a matter of who broke it first. The breaking point came over a shipment, Salvatore's cargo, Romano's docks, a misunderstanding that should have been resolved with a conversation. Instead, Romano made it personal. He didn't just take the shipment. He humiliated Salvatore's men, filmed it, and let the video circulate as a message. Salvatore could have let it go, should have, even. One shipment wasn't worth a war, but Romano didn't stop there. He pushed, tested boundaries, took more territory, made moves that forced Salvatore's hand. And when Salvatore finally responded, Romano acted shocked, as if he hadn't been lighting matches near gasoline for months. That's when the bodies started appearing. Not in alleys or abandoned warehouses. In public, staged, deliberate. Messages written in blood that only men in their world could read. 3 of Romano's men were the latest, buried before dawn in shallow graves outside the city, hands bound, mouths filled with dirt. The kind of execution that wasn't just about killing. It was about dominance, about making it clear that this war had crossed the point of return. But instead of retaliating, Salvatore vanished. No meetings, no sightings, no phone calls. His own men whispered nervously, wondering if he'd been taken out, if Romano had finally won. Romano's men celebrated quietly, thinking their boss had scared Salvatore into hiding. They were all wrong. Because while the city searched for Salvatore De Luca in the shadows, he walked through the front gates of Romano's estate wearing a servant's uniform, carrying cleaning supplies, and keeping his head down. It was the most audacious move of his career, and the most dangerous, because inside that mansion lived Isabella Romano, Vincenzo's only daughter, 26 years old. Quiet in a way that suggested intelligence, not timidity. She'd grown up, surrounded by violence she wasn't allowed to acknowledge, conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, and men who looked at her like a possession instead of a person. Her father loved her the way powerful men love anything they consider theirs fiercely, possessively, and with no regard for what she actually wanted. Isabella learned early to be careful. Careful with her words, careful with her expressions, careful with her dreams. She knew what happened to women in her world who asked for too much freedom. So she stayed quiet, stayed obedient, and built a life inside the margins her father allowed. But careful doesn't mean weak, and quiet doesn't mean empty. Isabella saw everything, heard everything, understood more than anyone gave her credit for. She knew her father's business, knew the blood behind the wealth, knew that every luxury she enjoyed came with a price someone else paid. And she hated it. Not openly, not loudly, but deeply, in the place where hope survives, even when it shouldn't. Salvatore noticed her immediately, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because of the way she moved through the house, like someone walking on glass, carefully avoiding the cracks. He recognized that carefulness. He'd built his entire life on it. And for the first time in years, Salvatore felt something close to curiosity. Who was this woman? What did she know? And why did watching her feel less like surveillance and more like witnessing something he wasn't supposed to see? He told himself it didn't matter, that she was just another piece on the board. Another variable in the plan. But even then, some part of him knew the truth. Isabella Romano was going to be a problem. Just not the kind he expected. The first 3 days were simple. Salvatore kept his head down, did his work, and listened. He mopped floors, polished silverware, carried trays. The other staff barely looked at him. To them, he was just another face in the rotation of workers who came and went from the Romano estate. Invisible, forgettable, exactly what he needed to be. The house itself was a fortress disguised as luxury. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, paintings worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But underneath, the elegance was infrastructure designed for war. Reinforced doors, security cameras in every hallway, Guards rotating shifts with military precision. Salvatore memorized it all. Guard changed times, blind spots in camera coverage. Which doors stayed unlocked after midnight? Which windows faced empty courtyards? He filed every detail away, building a mental map of the estate that would be useful when the time came. But then Isabella walked into the kitchen one morning, and the plan started to crack. She didn't look at him the way most people in the house did, which is to say, she actually looked at him, not with suspicion, not with curiosity. Just with the kind of basic acknowledgement that suggested she saw him as a person, not furniture. It was such a small thing, so insignificant it shouldn't have registered. But it did, because Salvatore couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him without fear, without calculation, without wondering what he wanted from them. Isabella poured herself coffee, said good morning to the staff, and left. That was it. No drama, no intrigue, just a moment of ordinary human decency, and it haunted him for the rest of the day. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that one polite greeting didn't mean anything, that he was reading too much into a woman who probably didn't even remember his face 10 minutes later. But that night, lying in the cramped staff quarters, Salvatore replayed the moment in his mind and realized something uncomfortable. He hadn't felt invisible in that kitchen. He'd felt seen. And he didn't know what to do with that. The rest of the week followed a similar pattern. Isabella moved through the house like a ghost, present but not intrusive, polite but not warm. She read in the library, took walks in the garden, avoided her father's business associates when they visited. Salvatore watched her the way he'd been trained to watch everyone, looking for weaknesses, patterns, leverage. But what he found instead was loneliness. It was in the way she hesitated before entering rooms, as if checking whether she was welcome. In the way she smiled at the staff but never asked them personal questions, as if she'd learned not to get close to people who could disappear. In the way she stared out windows with the expression of someone trapped behind glass. Salvatore recognized that loneliness because he'd lived it. Different circumstances, different prison. But the same isolation that comes from being surrounded by people who only see what you represent, never who you are. It bothered him more than it should have. Meanwhile, Romano's paranoia was growing. Salvatore overheard conversations between the guards, whispers about increased security, concerns about infiltration. Romano knew someone was coming for him. He just didn't know they were already inside. One afternoon, Salvatore was cleaning the hallway outside Romano's office when he heard voices rising. Romano was shouting. Not unusual. But this time, Isabella's voice came through the door, quieter but firm. Salvatore shouldn't have stopped, shouldn't have listened, but he did. Romano was talking about her future. A marriage, an alliance with another family. Business, he called it. Necessary, he said. Isabella's response was calm, measured, and completely ignored. The conversation ended with a door slamming and Isabella walking past Salvatore in the hallway, her face carefully blank. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just kept walking with that same composed expression she always wore, but her hands were shaking. Salvatore returned to his work, but something had shifted. This wasn't just reconnaissance anymore. He was starting to care. And that was the most dangerous thing that could happen, because men like Salvatore De Luca don't survive by caring. They survive by staying cold, staying focused, staying one step ahead of everyone else. But watching Isabella walk down that hallway, trapped in a life she didn't choose, something in him cracked. Just a hairline fracture, barely noticeable, but enough to let doubts seep in. That night, Salvatore made his first mistake. He spoke to her. It was late. The house was quiet. Isabella was in the garden, sitting on a bench under the stars. Salvatore was supposed to be finishing his rounds. Instead, he found himself walking toward her. She looked up when she heard footsteps, and for a moment, he thought she might be afraid. But she just smiled, tired, sad, real, and said, "You're the new one, right? I don't think we've been properly introduced." Salvatore should have made an excuse and left, should have stayed invisible. But instead, he sat down, and for the first time in 20 years, he told someone the truth. Not his real name, not his real story. but the truth about what it felt like to live in a cage built by someone else's expectations. Isabella listened, and when he finished, she said something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I don't hate my father's enemies. I just wish they understood the damage they leave behind." Salvatore left the garden that night, knowing he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. This was no longer a mission. It was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. The problem with pretending to be someone else is that, eventually, you forget which version of yourself is real. Salvatore had spent weeks inside the Romano estate, telling himself this was strategy, that every conversation with Isabella was reconnaissance, that every moment of kindness he showed was manipulation. But lies only work if you believe them, and Salvatore was starting to doubt. It began with small things. The way he started looking forward to seeing Isabella in the mornings. The way her voice pulled him out of whatever dark thought he'd been circling. The way he found himself lingering in rooms she occupied, not because he needed information, but because being near her felt like breathing after years underwater. He tried to rationalize it. Told himself he was just gathering intel, that understanding her was part of understanding Romano's vulnerabilities. But late at night, alone in his quarters, Salvatore faced a truth he couldn't outrun. He wasn't infiltrating anymore. He was involved. And involvement was the one thing men in his position couldn't afford. Isabella, for her part, had started to notice him too. Not as a servant, as a person. She'd catch him watching her sometimes, and instead of looking away, he'd hold her gaze for just a second too long. She'd ask him questions, small ones at first. Where he was from. What brought him to this work. Whether he had family. Salvatore answered carefully, threading truth through lies, giving her just enough to feel real without exposing who he actually was. But every conversation felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong word, one slip, and everything would collapse. The shift happened on a Tuesday. Isabella had been summoned to her father's office. Salvatore wasn't supposed to be nearby, but he'd learned Romano's patterns. When Romano called for Isabella, it usually meant bad news delivered as inevitability. This time was no different. Salvatore stood in the hallway, close enough to hear but far enough to maintain plausible deniability. Romano's voice came through the walls like thunder. The marriage was settled. The date was set. Isabella's input was irrelevant. She was a Romano, and Romanos did what was necessary for the family. Isabella's response was quiet. Too quiet for Salvatore to hear the words, but he heard the tone. Resignation. Defeat. The sound of someone who'd stopped fighting because they'd learned fighting only made things worse. When Isabella left the office, Salvatore was cleaning a nearby window. She walked past him without acknowledgement. Her face, a perfect mask, but her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone drowning in plain sight, screaming silently while everyone around them pretended not to notice. Salvatore finished his work, returned to his quarters, sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall. And for the first time in 20 years, he asked himself a question that terrified him. What if everything he'd built his life on was wrong? What if power wasn't the answer? What if control was just another word for cowardice? What if the only thing more dangerous than being feared was never being known? The questions spiraled, and with them came memories Salvatore had spent decades burying. His mother's voice, his father's broken body, the moment he'd chosen to become something cold because being warm had gotten everyone he loved destroyed. He'd told himself that transformation was survival. That becoming feared was the only way to stay safe. But watching Isabella's life being decided without her consent, Salvatore saw his own reflection. Different circumstances, different prison. But the same fundamental truth. They were both trapped by other people's violence. That night, Salvatore found Isabella in the library. She was curled in an armchair, staring at a book she wasn't reading. He should have walked away, should have maintained distance. But instead, he asked, "Are you okay?" It was the stupidest question he could have asked. Of course, she wasn't okay. But Isabella looked up, and something in her expression cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears or confessions, just a small, sad smile that said everything. "Do you ever feel like your life isn't yours?" she asked. Salvatore sat down across from her, and for the second time, he told her the truth. Every day, they talked for hours. Not about the war, not about her father or his enemies, about life, about choices, about what it means to be trapped in a story someone else is writing. Isabella told him about growing up in a house where love and control were indistinguishable, where safety came with chains, where every gift had conditions attached. Salvatore told her about learning to survive by becoming something people feared instead of something people knew, about the loneliness that comes with power, about the cage he'd built so carefully that he forgot he was the one locked inside. And somewhere in that conversation, something shifted. Isabella looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "You're not like the others." Salvatore's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "The other staff," she clarified. "They're here because they need the work. You're here because you're hiding from something." She wasn't accusing him, just observing. But the accuracy of it terrified him. Salvatore should have deflected, should have lied. But instead, he met her eyes and said, "Maybe I'm hiding from myself." Isabella didn't push, didn't demand explanations. She just nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. And then she said something that broke him. "I hope you find what you're looking for, even if it's not what you expected." Salvatore left the library that night, knowing he'd reached a point of no return. Because Isabella Romano, the daughter of his enemy, the woman he'd come here to use as leverage, had just offered him more grace than he'd shown anyone in 20 years. And the worst part? He didn't deserve it, not even close. Over the following days, Salvatore's internal war intensified. Every instinct screamed at him to finish the mission, to remember why he was here, to stop confusing strategy with emotion. But every conversation with Isabella pulled him further from that certainty. She talked about wanting to choose her own life, about dreaming of something beyond the walls her father built, about wondering if people like them could ever really be free, or if they were just trading one cage for another. And Salvatore realized something that made him sick. He'd spent 20 years becoming the exact thing he hated, a man who controlled others because he was terrified of being controlled himself. A man who chose fear over connection because connection required vulnerability. A man who'd convinced himself that power was freedom when really it was just a prettier prison. Meanwhile, Romano's paranoia reached new heights. More guards, more restrictions, more violence lurking beneath the surface. Salvatore overheard plans, threats, orders to eliminate anyone suspected of disloyalty. The walls were closing in. Soon, Romano would tighten security enough that escape would be impossible. Salvatore had two choices. Execute his original plan, use what he'd learned to destroy Romano, leverage Isabella if necessary, and walk away with his empire intact. Or do something he'd never done before. Choose someone else over himself. The first option was safer, smarter, everything he'd built his life on. The second option was reckless, emotional, the kind of choice that got people killed. But when Salvatore closed his eyes, he didn't see empires or territories or revenge. He saw Isabella sitting in that library, asking if people like them could ever really be free. And for the first time in his life, Salvatore De Luca decided that some things were worth more than survival. Even if he had no idea how to save them. Even if trying meant losing everything. Even if the only way forward was to finally, after decades of hiding, let someone see exactly who he was, and hope that when the truth came out, there'd be anything left worth saving. The moment Salvatore decided to protect Isabella instead of use her, everything became exponentially more dangerous. Because protection requires proximity. And proximity, in a house built on suspicion, invites questions. He started small, positioning himself near her during family gatherings where tension ran high, making sure he was assigned to clean areas she frequented so he could monitor who approached her, listening more carefully to conversations that mentioned her name. It felt like walking a tightrope. One side was the mission he'd abandoned. The other was a future he couldn't see clearly but somehow needed to reach. And below was a fall that would destroy them both. Their conversations became the only real moments in Salvatore's day. Everything else was performance. But when Isabella spoke, he listened as himself, not as the role he was playing. She told him about her mother, who died when Isabella was 12. How her father had never recovered from that loss, had channeled his grief into control, as if keeping Isabella locked away could prevent death from taking her too. She told him about the marriage he was arranging. A man twice her age, cruel by reputation. Someone her father owed a debt to. She was payment. Salvatore listened to all of it, with a rage building in his chest that he couldn't release. Because releasing it would expose him, and exposure would end his ability to help her. Isabella, in turn, asked him questions he wasn't prepared to answer honestly, about his past, his family, what he wanted from life. Salvatore gave her half-truths wrapped in misdirection, threading enough reality through the lies that they felt authentic. He told her about growing up powerless, about learning that the world respects strength and devours weakness, about building walls so high that eventually he forgot what it felt like to let someone in. Everything he said was true. He just left out the part about becoming one of the most dangerous men in the city, about being the reason bodies showed up in shallow graves, about planning her father's destruction from inside his own home. But the conversations weren't one-sided. Isabella shared something Salvatore hadn't expected: hope. Despite everything, despite the life being forced on her, she still believed people could choose differently, that cycles could break, that violence wasn't inevitable. It was the most naive thing Salvatore had ever heard, and it destroyed him, because he'd spent 20 years proving the opposite. And now, here was this woman, trapped in a world as brutal as his, still believing in the possibility of something better. It made him feel like a coward. Meanwhile, Romano's paranoia infected the entire household. Security doubled overnight. Guards were rotated unpredictably. Staff members were questioned about anything unusual they'd seen or heard. 2 housekeepers were fired without explanation, escorted out by armed men who made it clear that asking questions was dangerous. The tension became suffocating. Everyone walked carefully, spoke quietly, avoided eye contact with the guards. Salvatore knew he was running out of time. Romano suspected infiltration. He just hadn't figured out who yet. The close calls started piling up. One afternoon, Salvatore was cleaning near Romano's office when the door opened unexpectedly. Romano stepped out with 2 of his enforcers, discussing someone who'd been asking questions about the estate's security. Salvatore kept his head down, kept moving, praying they wouldn't look twice. They didn't, but his hands shook for an hour afterward. Another time, one of the senior guards stopped Salvatore in the hallway and asked how long he'd been working there. The question was casual, the eyes weren't. Salvatore gave the rehearsed answer, adding just enough detail to sound genuine without inviting follow-up. The guard nodded and walked away, but Salvatore knew he was being watched now. The house was tightening like a noose. Then came the night that changed everything. Isabella's fiancé visited for dinner. Salvatore wasn't supposed to be serving, but he volunteered when he heard the man was coming. He needed to see what Isabella was being sold into. The man's name was Franco Messina, mid-50s, expensive suit, dead eyes. He spoke to Isabella the way someone speaks to property they're about to acquire, appraising, possessive, entitled. At one point, he reached across the table and grabbed her hand, squeezing it while making a comment about how obedient she seemed. Isabella smiled politely, but Salvatore saw her jaw tighten, saw her free hand curl into a fist under the table, saw the way she stared at her plate like she was trying to disappear into it. Romano laughed at something, Messina said. Toasted to family and alliances and the future. The whole performance made Salvatore sick. When dinner ended and the men retired to Romano's office, Salvatore found Isabella in the garden. She was standing perfectly still, staring at nothing. He approached carefully. She didn't turn around, just said quietly, "I can't do this." Salvatore's chest tightened. "You don't have to." She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You don't understand. I don't get to choose. No one asks what I want." Salvatore stepped closer. What if someone did ask? Isabella finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't cried. It wouldn't matter. My father has already decided. Salvatore made a decision in that moment that he knew he couldn't take back. Then maybe your father doesn't get the final word. Isabella's expression shifted. Confusion. Then something sharper. Who are you? It was the first time she'd asked directly. And Salvatore realized he was standing at the edge of the cliff he'd been avoiding for weeks. He could lie, deflect, walk away. Or he could do the one thing that terrified him more than bullets, more than betrayal, more than death. He could tell her the truth. But before he could answer, footsteps approached. One of the guards. Doing rounds. Salvatore stepped back into his role, nodding politely and returning to the house. But as he walked away, he felt Isabella's eyes on him, watching, questioning, starting to see past the disguise. And he knew the clock had just started counting down to the moment when everything would fall apart. If you're still watching, comment where you think this is heading. Because what happens next will either save them both or destroy them. And honestly, even Salvatore doesn't know which one it'll be. Isabella started watching him differently after that night in the garden. Not with suspicion, exactly. More like someone solving a puzzle they hadn't realized was there. She'd catch his eye across rooms and hold it a second too long. Ask questions that seemed innocent but weren't. Test his reactions to things a normal servant wouldn't care about. Salvatore felt the ground shifting beneath him. He'd spent his entire adult life controlling information, managing perceptions, staying 3 steps ahead of everyone around him. But Isabella was closing the distance, and he didn't know how to stop her without confirming what she was starting to suspect. The breaking point came during a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. Romano was in his office with Messina, discussing the wedding timeline. But they were also discussing something else. A plan to eliminate a rival. Not subtly, not quietly, publicly, violently. A message that would echo through the entire city. Salvatore stood frozen in the hallway, listening to Romano describe an execution that would kill not just his target, but anyone nearby. Collateral damage wasn't a concern. It was part of the point. Messina laughed, said something about making sure the news covered it properly. Romano agreed. And Salvatore realized with sickening clarity that these men didn't just accept violence, they enjoyed it. Later that evening, Isabella found him in the kitchen. The staff had gone to bed. The house was quiet, except for the distant sound of guards making rounds. She sat down across from him without asking permission. Just studied his face for a long moment, then said, "You're not a servant." It wasn't a question. Salvatore's pulse spiked, but his expression didn't change. "I work here." "That's not what I said." Isabella leaned forward slightly. "You move wrong, talk wrong. You're too aware of everything happening around you. And when my father's men walked past earlier, you tracked them like you were assessing a threat, not like you were afraid of getting in trouble." Salvatore should have denied it. Should have laughed it off as paranoia or imagination. But looking at Isabella's face, he realized something. She wasn't scared of him. She was hoping she was right. Because if he wasn't who he claimed to be, maybe he was someone who could actually help her. So, instead of lying, he asked, "What do you think I am?" Isabella took a breath. "I think you're someone my father would kill if he knew you were here. And I think you're staying anyway." Which means either you're incredibly stupid or you have a reason worth dying for. The accuracy of it hit Salvatore like a punch. "And if you're right, then I need you to tell me the truth," Isabella said. "Because in 3 weeks, I'm being married to a man who makes my father look merciful. And if there's any possibility that you're here for a reason that could change that, I need to know now." Salvatore stared at her, at this woman who'd figured him out, not through suspicion, but through hope, who was brave enough to confront him, even though doing so could get her killed. Who was asking him to trust her when trust was the one thing he'd sworn never to give anyone again. He opened his mouth to answer, and that's when they heard it. Footsteps, multiple pairs. Moving with purpose, Romano's voice, sharp and commanding, giving orders. Someone had made a mistake. Someone had been discovered. Salvatore's mind raced through possibilities. Had one of his men been caught? Had Romano finally connected the dots? The footsteps were getting closer. Isabella's eyes widened. You need to leave. Now. But Salvatore knew it was too late. If he ran, he'd be caught. If he stayed, he'd be questioned. Either way, his cover was about to collapse, so he made a choice. He grabbed Isabella's hand, looked her directly in the eyes, and said the 3 words that would change everything. Trust me. Please. Isabella didn't hesitate. She nodded. And when Romano burst into the kitchen with 4 armed guards, he found his daughter sitting alone at the table, looking startled. Where's the new servant? Romano demanded. Isabella's face was perfect innocence. He just left. Said something about needing air. Why? What's wrong? Romano ignored her question, snapping orders to the guards to search the grounds. As they dispersed, he turned back to Isabella. Stay in your room. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Isabella stood, keeping her expression carefully neutral. Is someone trying to hurt us? Romano's face softened slightly. I'm handling it. You don't need to worry. He kissed her forehead and left. Isabella waited until his footsteps faded. Then she returned to the kitchen, opened the pantry door, and found Salvatore pressed against the back wall behind shelves of supplies. Their faces were inches apart in the cramped space, both of them breathing hard. They're searching for someone, Isabella whispered. Do you know who? Salvatore nodded slowly. Isabella's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes acknowledged what that meant. Then we don't have much time. We? Isabella's voice was steady. If you're who I think you are, you can't do this alone anymore. And if I'm going to help you, I need the truth. All of it. Salvatore looked at this woman who just risked everything to hide him. This woman who had every reason to hate people like him. This woman who was offering him something he hadn't had in 20 years. An ally he hadn't earned. Trust he didn't deserve. A chance he'd stopped believing existed. And for the first time since he'd walked through the gates of the Romano estate, Salvatore De Luca stopped calculating, stopped strategizing, stopped hiding behind the armor he'd built to survive, and told her everything. The words came out like a confession, like poison he'd been carrying so long it had become part of his blood. Salvatore told Isabella his real name. Told her about the empire he'd built through fear and silence. Told her about the bodies, the territory, the war that had been escalating for months between him and her father. He told her about the 3 men buried before dawn, about walking into this house with a plan to destroy everything her father had built, about using her as leverage if necessary. He didn't soften it, didn't try to make himself sympathetic, just gave her the raw, ugly truth of who he was and what he'd come here to do. When he finished, the silence in that pantry felt like death. Isabella's face was unreadable. Salvatore waited for the scream, the betrayal, the rage, waited for her to call the guards and end this. Instead, she asked one question. Is that still the plan? Salvatore blinked. What? Using me as leverage, destroying my father. Is that still what you're here to do? And Salvatore realized he couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. Not after she'd just saved him. No, Isabella's expression didn't change. Why not? It was the simplest question, and the hardest one Salvatore had ever been asked. Because the real answer wasn't tactical, wasn't strategic. It was something far more dangerous. The real answer was that somewhere between mopping floors and late-night conversations, between watching her survive in a prison disguised as a palace and hearing her talk about hope like it was something worth protecting, Salvatore had stopped seeing Isabella as a variable in someone else's war. He'd started seeing her as the only person in 20 years who'd looked at him without fear, without calculation, without wanting something from him, and that had broken something in him he didn't know could still break. So he told her the truth. Because you made me remember what I was trying to protect when I first chose this life, before it became about power, before I forgot why any of it mattered. Isabella's eyes searched his face. And what was that? People who deserve better than the world we've built for them. The words hung between them. Then Isabella said something that shattered him completely. After everything you've done, after all the people you've hurt, after coming into my home planning to use me as a weapon against my father, why should I believe you've changed? It was the question Salvatore had been avoiding since the moment he realized his plan had fallen apart. And the answer was simple and terrible. You shouldn't. Isabella inhaled sharply. Salvatore continued, his voice raw. I haven't earned your trust, haven't earned your help, haven't earned anything except exactly what your father would do to me if he found out who I am. But I'm asking anyway, not because I deserve it, because you do. You deserve a choice. You deserve a life that's yours. And if helping me is the only way you get that, then I'm asking you to take the risk, even though I'm the worst bet you could possibly make. The pantry felt impossibly small. Isabella's breathing was the only sound. Then she asked the question that destroyed the last wall Salvatore had left. After everything you've built, after 20 years of surviving by never letting anyone close, after convincing yourself that fear was the only thing that mattered, do you still believe this life is worth the cost? Salvatore had spent 2 decades answering that question one way, with violence, with territory, with power that proved to everyone, including himself, that he'd made the right choice. That becoming something cold and untouchable was the only way to survive. But standing in that pantry with Isabella, surrounded by the ruins of every certainty he'd ever built, Salvatore finally told the truth. No, one word, but it contained everything. Every person he'd hurt, every choice he'd justified, every piece of himself he'd traded for safety, that turned out to be just another kind of prison. Isabella's expression softened, not with pity, with something far more dangerous, understanding. Then maybe, she said quietly, it's time to build something different. And Salvatore realized that this woman, who should hate him, who had every reason to destroy him, had just offered him the one thing he'd spent 20 years believing didn't exist. Redemption. Not earned, not deserved. Just offered freely by someone brave enough to believe people could change. Even when all the evidence said they couldn't. The war ended not with an explosion, but with exposure. Salvatore and Isabella worked together over the next 72 hours to dismantle Romano's operation from the inside. Not violently. Not through the methods Salvatore had used his entire life, but through something far more effective. Truth. Isabella knew her father's business better than anyone suspected. She'd spent years listening from the shadows, understanding the networks, the weaknesses, the deals that held everything together. She knew which alliances were fragile, which men were loyal only because they were afraid, which operations existed on the edge of legality. Together, they leaked information to authorities, to rival families, to journalists who'd been waiting years for evidence. They exposed Romano's plans for the public execution, revealed his financial crimes, made it impossible for him to hide. Romano fell not because someone stronger destroyed him, but because the empire he'd built on fear collapsed the moment people stopped being afraid. His allies abandoned him. His protection evaporated. Within a week, authorities had enough evidence to put him away for life. Messina, too. The entire network crumbled because someone finally shone light on what everyone had been pretending not to see. Salvatore could have walked away clean. Could have returned to his empire, his power, his carefully constructed life. But he didn't, because Isabella had asked him one more question before it all ended. What are you going to do now? And Salvatore had realized something that changed everything. Power without humanity wasn't strength. It was just fear dressed up as control. And he was done being afraid. So Salvatore did the hardest thing he'd ever done. He dismantled his own empire, not because someone forced him, because he chose to. He exposed his operations, took responsibility for his crimes, turned himself in alongside Romano, refusing the privilege of walking away, while others paid for their choices. The authorities were shocked. Rival families were confused. His own people thought he'd lost his mind. But Salvatore understood something they didn't. Some prisons are visible, some aren't. And he'd been locked in the invisible kind for 20 years. This was the only way out. Isabella testified against her father, not for revenge, for closure, for the possibility of building something real instead of inheriting something broken. When the trials ended, she walked out of that courthouse free for the first time in her life. Salvatore watched from behind bars, knowing he'd be there for years, knowing he deserved it, knowing that some debts can only be paid with time. But before Isabella left, she visited him one last time. She didn't say much, just placed her hand against the glass and said, "Thank you for choosing differently." Salvatore pressed his hand against hers, separated by barriers but connected by something real. "Thank you for believing I could." Isabella smiled. Not the careful, practiced smile she'd worn in her father's house, but something genuine, something that suggested the future might actually contain hope. Then she left, and Salvatore sat in that cell understanding the lesson that had taken him 40 years to learn. Not every victory is loud. Not every win involves walking away untouched. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is choosing to be human again, even when it costs everything. Sometimes, freedom isn't about power. It's about finally being honest about who you are and what you've done. And sometimes, the person you least expect offers you a chance to be better. Not because you deserve it, but because they believe everyone deserves the possibility of change, even people who've spent decades proving they don't. What would you have done in Salvatore's place? Would you have chosen power or redemption? Would you have kept the armor or taken the risk of being seen? And here's the harder question. How many of us are living in prisons we built ourselves, convinced we're safe, when really, we're just alone? Isabella saw something in Salvatore that he'd stopped seeing in himself. The possibility of change, the chance to be more than his worst choices. If this story moved you, drop a comment telling us what you'd choose: power or connection, safety or truth. And if you're not subscribed yet, what's stopping you? These stories dig deeper than entertainment. They ask the questions most people spend their lives avoiding. Click subscribe, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see everything, including yourself. Years later, someone asked Salvatore if he regretted his choice, if giving up everything was worth it. He thought about Isabella walking out of that courthouse free, about the lives that weren't destroyed because he chose differently, about finally sleeping without the weight of 20 years of violence pressing against his chest. And he said something that surprised even himself. "I spent 2 decades building an empire on fear, but the only thing I built that mattered happened in the 3 months I spent learning to be human again." Not every story ends with happiness, but some end with something better: truth, redemption, the quiet knowledge that even when we've gone too far, there's still a chance to turn around, if we're brave enough to take it, even when bravery looks like surrender.